This is Miss Sadie's Divining Parlor, July 15th, 1936, page 248. We're going to page 263. After the Sunday night service, folks said their goodbyes and thank yous. Shady sat down heavily in one of the pews. It seemed that the evening had taken a toll on him. I put my hand on his shoulder. That was a good service, Shady. It was, he agreed, but didn't say more. Seems like everyone in this town's got a story to tell. Shady nodded. I believe you're right about that. The Lord himself knew the power of a good story, how it can reach out and wrap around a person like a warm blanket. That's a simile. How the power of a good story can reach out and wrap around a person like a warm blanket. I thought it over. He was right. I just wish my daddy'd wrap me up in that warm blanket instead of leaving me out in the cold. So, is it cold where she's at? No, but she's using this simile to compare how she feels. She feels that she's been abandoned, and she feels like that's being left out in the cold. I wouldn't ask Shady about Mrs. Evans' daughter. Not that night anyway, but I knew how I could settle my mind about it. There was just daylight enough to run the stretch of woods over to the cemetery next to Miss Shady's house. I started at one end and worked my way down a row of graves and then another, reading each name carefully, expecting but hoping not to find Miss Margaret Evans. Then I saw big block letters engraved in the heavy granite stone. Evans, John, devoted husband and father, 1868 to 1926. I knew that it was Mrs. Evans' husband, as her name was on the tombstone next to it with her date of birth and her date of death left blank. But there was no Margaret. I was relieved. It didn't solve everything, like why Miss Evans spoke the way she did about her daughter and why Hattie Mae had held her hand. But I could rest easy knowing that there was no Margaret Evans buried in Manifest. She was probably married and living in Joplin or Kansas City with children of her own. Maybe Miss Evans just missed her. I hoped so. It was dark as I turned to go back to Shady's. Miss Sadie's wind chimes jangled in the hot breeze. For some reason, I felt my scar and thought of Miss Sadie's painful oozing leg. I walked to the wheeled iron gate and started down the path to perdition, unable to move. Unable to go in and check on Miss Sadie and unable to turn away. I was paralyzed with the need to tend to her and ignore her in equal measures. Then from the shadows on the porch, she spoke to me, beckoning from her darkness to mine. It was a dangerous game we played. I opened the gate. What, faking a town quarantine? No, what we did in addition to that. I sat on the top step, my back against the porch rail. What could be more dangerous than faking quarantine in a town-sponsored bootlegging operation? Hope. Distribution, September 1st, 1918. Word of the miracle elixir had spread well beyond Manifest before the quarantine began. Mrs. Larkin hadn't been the only one whose fever and cough had improved because of the medicine, although most of the folks whose symptoms had improved were the men who met up with Shady at the old abandoned mine shaft just outside of town to purchase their moonshine. These were the same men who preferred to drink away their fever and chills. Usually they just woke up with a whopping headache on top of their other ailments, but one after another was rising from a long night of cold sweats and raging fevers, feeling like he had come through a storm. If it had been left to the men, the miracle elixir would probably have gone unnoticed. They would have chalked it up as just one of the well-known perks of a few stiff drinks. And since Velmatee's elixir was something relegated largely to newspaper advertisements and jokes, people would have been none the wiser. The wives and mothers were the ones who found the brown bottles stashed away under pillow and bed. The women who had been nursing these men in their infirmity and their sickness wondered how they'd suddenly improved while others lingered in the sickness. The women sniffed the bottles and knew there were other ingredients at work in that liquor. It wasn't just liquor. Menthol, castor oil, and eucalyptus, among others. They gave the medicine to sick children and parents and took it themselves when fevers and coughs grew worse. The coughs, fever, and chills went away. The mystery elixir worked, but the bottles emptied. And with more loved ones getting sick and word spreading of an even worse strain of influenza heading west from Chicago, Indianapolis, and Des Moines, those wives and mothers were determined to protect their families. So you can only imagine if someone came up with a miracle elixir for coronavirus. You can only imagine how everyone would be trying to get this. They wouldn't be able to make it fast enough, almost like Clorox wipes. I've looked and looked for Clorox wipes. They used to be at every store. Mr. Lazalier just saw toilet paper at Reese's today and got really excited. So you can see how in times of a pandemic or times of sickness, the things that people think they're going to need for comfort and to feel better sell out very quickly. The directions were simple. Follow the railroad tracks heading west of Manifest. Where the tracks curved south, they were to veer north into the woods. There, between the hackberry tree and the pin oak, hidden by numerous weeds and shrubs, was the entrance to the abandoned mine shaft. By the beginning of September, Shady and Jinx made their first trip of the quarantine in the dark of night, the elixir bottles resting in the hay of a wheelbarrow. From the in-ground hiding spot, they waited for the sick and weary to come. And they did come. Worn and worried faces, men, women, and children who came with baskets and money. They received their brown bottles in grateful silence and gave what they had. Some gave dollars, some coins, a few brought only empty bottles for the next person to use. One woman, pale and thin, handed Jinx a bundled up red handkerchief. He felt the rattle of grains inside. "It's mustard seed," she said through the gaps between her teeth. "Good for hot packs to clear the lungs." Jinx nodded and handed her a bottle. He remembered the pungent smell of the mustard pack his mother had used on him when he was a child. The memory was seared into his chest. A few people in Manifest had succumbed to fatigue and mild flu symptoms. They'd all been working around the clock. Maybe a hot pack would do them good. So it was like the precursor to the socks that you see people put corn kernels in, or rice, and you heat them up in the microwave. This was kind of the precursor to like Vicks Vapor Rub. "Thank you," Jinx said, looking up, but like a ghost, she was gone. More came as the night went on. Jinx nearly fell asleep during a lull. He had hardly slept for days. Perhaps that would explain why he thought he looked into a familiar face as he held out another bottle. It was a man's. There was a coldness to the face and a smile, but not a friendly one. Then the man was gone. Was it Finn? Was it anyone? It happened so quickly Jinx couldn't be sure, but the bottle was gone. Jinx retreated into the protective earthen walls of the shaft, waiting for his heart to stop racing. He thought of the last time he had seen that face, how it had looked up from Junior Haskell's lifeless body and said, "You killed him." "You okay?" Shady asked. "Yeah, I thought I saw someone I knew." Jinx shook his head. His mind swirled like a dust devil, conflicting memories chasing each other in circles. "Someone you'd rather forget?" Jinx nodded. Shady moved into the opening, placing himself between Jinx and whatever or whoever might be lurking in the darkness as time crept on. It had been a while since the last person had passed through. The birds began chirping as they did just before light without a word. Shady and Jinx hid the empty bottles and various other gifts of payment in the hay of the wheelbarrow and headed back to town. Both tired and on edge, they walked in silence for a time. Then they heard a creak. Out for your morning constitutional, gentlemen? It was Sheriff Dean. Leaning against an old picket fence, he whittled casually on a small piece of wood. The sheriff never violated the quarantine by venturing into town, but he apparently did venture from his house once in a while. No, sir, Sheriff. Shady took off his hat and patted it nervously against his leg. A brisk walk would be nice, but we're out, you see, we're on a mission of mercy, Jinx answered. Mission of mercy, you say? Sheriff Dean eyed the wheelbarrow, but kept a safe distance. That wouldn't involve doling out alcoholic libations, would it? No, sir. Jinx reached into the wheelbarrow and pulled out the red handkerchief the old woman had given him. Mustard seed. He rattled the grains. Velma T's working on some hot packs to help clear the lungs. She asked us to find some of the herbs she needs. You can look for yourself, Jinx offered. There's even a couple of mustard packs in here that helped a few people sweat out their fever and chills. Okay, are there really mustard packs in there, or is he holding the only mustard seed they have? He's holding it. But why would he tell the sheriff, hey, go ahead and take a look? The sheriff wants to know if they have alcohol in there. Now remember, last time the sheriff was more interested in how much alcohol he could get out of Shady rather than enforcing the prohibition law. And why would he tell him, hey, go ahead and take a look? And you know what? There's even a couple of used mustard packs down in here that people use to sweat out their fever and chills. Well, during this pandemic, if someone said, you know what, go ahead and take a look. There's even some face masks that people have coughed on down in there, and there's even some gloves that people use that they coughed all over. Would I want to touch those things? No way would I want to touch those things. So he's telling him that there are used mustard packs in there so that he'll be like, that's good, I don't want to look. Because they don't want him to find their bottles of elixir. Where are we at? Okay, Sheriff Dean leaned back, apparently not wanting to risk contact with a sweaty mustard pack. He crossed his arms over his belly and narrowed his eyes at Jinx. You know, there's a fella been seen hanging around these woods, camping down by the river not far from my house. He fits the description of one of those runaways the Joplin authorities are looking for. Now, didn't he think he just saw Jinx? And now he's saying there's a man that fits the description of the older man they're looking for? I saw him myself from a distance, but he moved on quick enough. Only thing is, he's supposed to be one of a pair. Jinx and Shady didn't comment. Causes me to wonder why this fella'd be coming around manifest. Maybe he's looking for his other half, or better half. Maybe, Jinx said. Is he insinuating that maybe he thinks he knows Jinx is the other half? If you see a stranger around, you all let me know. Sheriff Dean stepped to the side, studying Jinx from a different angle. Of course, you're somewhat of a stranger yourself. Jinx stayed put. Truth is, Sheriff Dean continued, his sharp knife peeling away layers of wood, as I believe I mentioned before, the sheriff from Joplin happens to be my brother-in-law, and he's not too bright. If he let some ne'er-do-wells get away, that's his own fault. He stopped whittling and checked the blade against his thumb. Then he looked straight at Jinx. But this is my town, and I make the rules here. I'll be watching you. He paused to let his point sink in. See that you stick closer to town. We don't need the influenza spreading to the outskirts. Yes, sir, Jinx and Shady answered. They waited for the sheriff to leave, but they leaned back against the fence and whittled away at his block of wood. With a nod, Jinx and Shady continued on their way back to town. The sheriff wasn't just keeping watch. It was a downright vigil. A single candle lit Shady's place, and the mood was equally dark. Small clusters of men huddled around tables waiting for someone to speak. "What are we going to do now?" asked Donald McGregor. "With Sheriff Dean watching our comings and goings, you can't just waltz in and out of town unnoticed." "And Lester Burton's been phoning in twice a day to the switchboard," said Ivan DeVore, checking to see if the men are well enough to go back to work. "He won't be satisfied somebody's not fit to work until they're dead and buried. And even then he'll dock their past wages for not reporting to work." Jinx thought it strange that Burton was calling in. What news did he expect to find out? Who had he been talking to, and more importantly, who'd been talking to him? Of course, not everyone in town had been apprised of the fake influenza before it happened. They just had to hope that the people in town during the quarantine were tired enough of the mind's chokehold on them to go along with the scheme. "What about the boy?" Herman Kufer asked somewhat accusingly. "Hasn't he got another rabbit to pull from his bag of tricks?" Suddenly, all eyes were on Jinx, who sat quietly on a stool behind the bar. Their faces reminded Jinx of Sheriff Dean's warning. He had been identified as a stranger and felt his sense of belonging slipping away. Shady sheltered Jinx again, this time from the stares of those waiting for yet another miracle. "We'll have to just keep producing the elixir till we figure out a way to distribute it again." There was an uneasy scraping and shifting of chairs on the dusty wooden floors. This time it was Donald McGregor who came to the rescue. "Now, come on, I'm sure we've all got better things to do than fuss and fidget around here all day. Let's move along." Like a mother hen, he gathered up his chicks, sometimes nudging, sometimes snapping, and shooed them out the door. Donald remained in the entryway as if posting himself sentry. But Jinx slid silently from his perch and left Shady's place, letting the doors swing shut behind him. The mood in the town was already somber when the first death of the quarantine was reported a few days later. Mr. Underhill prepared a pine box and was quite put out when Donald said he would take care of the rest. The body would be buried out of town, they said, to keep the smell and germs away. With shovels in hand, Shady, Jinx, and Donald McGregor carried the casket out of town. Each sagged under the weight of their heavy task. They reached the clearing not far from the abandoned mine shaft and took turns digging near an old craggy sycamore tree, 6 feet down and 4 feet across. Late afternoon shadows crept across the clearing as Donald threw out the last shovel of dirt. He wiped his brow and accepted a canteen of cool water. Shady offered when Lester Burton emerged from the trees. "So Lester Burton's back." "I heard there's been a death." "You heard that, did you?" Donald said. "Word sure gets around even in a quarantine." "So someone's talking to Lester Burton." "Who is it?" His abrupt speech indicated what the men already knew. Burton's primary interest was in discovering if he'd lost a miner, and if so, was there a strong son of 13 or 14 left behind to take his place. 13 or 14. "Garuni," said Donald. "Garuni? I don't know him." "Aye, God rest his soul," Donald said. "He didn't say much. He lived in the little house behind me, kept to himself mostly." He took in a breath. "No, I didn't know him well, but he could eat, that one. Most of us bachelors, both of us bachelors, I'd often fix extra. My cooking wasn't the best, mind you, but I never heard a word of complaint out of him." Shady stood by the open grave and removed his hat. "It's time, Donald." So they've told Lester Burton that the person who died was named Garuni and that he lived in the shed or the little house behind McGregor's house, and that McGregor took food to him. All right, let's lay him down. Okay, we have to catch up Mr. Lazalier here. So the sheriff has threatened Shady and Jinx. He's identified Jinx as a stranger and indicated that he thinks he might be one of the men that they're looking for out of Joplin.
Right.
Okay.
I got that part.
So the sheriff is hanging out on the path they would have to walk to go to and from the mine to distribute their miracle elixir, okay, for this Spanish flu, which hasn't really hit manifest, but they've acted like it is to get the mine closed down.
Well, a little dab will do ya.
So they can't figure out how they're going to get to and from the mine now because the sheriff's watching, okay, the abandoned mine shaft where they're selling the illegal stuff. So there's been a death in manifest.
Uh-oh. Who died?
So Mr. Underhill made the box, made the little pine box or regular pine box. And they carried this. They said, you know what, you just make the box. We're going to bury the body. And we're going to bury the body outside of town so that it won't smell. And because this person had the flu, then it'll be outside of town.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So I want you to listen to how Lester Burton shows up because he's got a mole inside the town. And he says, who was it that died? Now, this is how they described him. Garooney, said Donald. Garooney, I don't know him, said Lester Burton. Aye, God rest his soul, Donald said. He didn't say much. He lived in the little house behind me, kept to himself mostly. No, I didn't know him well, but he could eat that one. Both of us bachelors, I'd often fix extra. My cooking wasn't the best, mind you, but I never heard a word of complaint out of him. Okay. With me so far?
I'm with you so far.
Shady stood by the open grave, removed his hat. It's time, Donald. All right, let's lay him down. Wait, said Burton. Let me see him. A note of suspicion rose in his voice as if this Mr. Garooney might have a few hours' work left in him. I don't think so if he's dead.
I'm thinking not.
But that's the kind of swell guy Lester Burton is. I don't think you'll want to be doing that, said Donald. He's been dead more than a day, not exactly fresh, if you know what I mean. I said, let me see. Right, Donald nodded at Jinx, who pried open the lid of the coffin. Immediately, such a stench arose from the casket that Burton covered his nose and nearly retched. Jinx let the half-open lid drop back down.
Bang.
Aye, Donald said, the smell of rotting flesh is one few can stomach. When Mr. McTweed was a lad back in Lochinver, he was on his way home from the pub. He took the shortcut through the Ballynock Grove when a wild boar charged him, goring his leg, nearly tearing it off before McTweed could reach his knife and slice open the boar's throat. 3 days he lay there in the stench of the rotting beast and his own festering flesh still caught on the animal's tusks. Donald McGregor took a slow drag from his pipe and let the smoke curl out of his mouth like the story itself. When some local lads came upon him, McTweed lay pinned beneath the bloated, oozing carcass, clawing and scratching. He was already fighting his unseen demons. The infection eventually took his leg, but 'twas the stench of death that drove him mad. But, Donald said, his mood suddenly brightening, come have a look if you must. Oh, he's made it sound real appealing, hasn't he?
Mm-hmm.
He gave the coffin lid a yank, sending another waft of odor floating up.
Woo!
He is not at full steam yet. Burton covered his mouth and gagged again. Just hurry up and bury him. He whipped out a ragged bandana to cover his nose and stalked away. The men waited until he was gone. Then Shady and Jinx lurched away from the open grave, gasping for air. Blast it, Donald, did you have to open it a second time? Croaked Shady. I was barely keeping it in as it was. Well, it got rid of him, didn't it? And I don't expect he'll be coming back around to check again. Donald opened the pine box. Now we think it's some man named Garooney. Ah, Stanley, God rest your soul. He hoisted out a smaller metal box lying within the pine coffin. A finer pig there never was.
There you go.
He'd been ailing for a time, so I do suppose it was right to put him down. So who was the dead person in the box?
The pig.
A pig. Where'd you come up with the name Garuni? Asked Jinx. Matt Nopolis told me it's Greek for pig. Garuni. Donald rolled his R's as he said it. Then he wagged a finger at Jinx. You were right, lad, to come prepared for Burton. But how do you think you knew we'd be here? Shady and Jinx were still holding their breath. Donald, please, just take it in the woods and bury it, said Shady. No one's going to come around with that smell surrounding us. So now they're going to go bury the pig, who's in a much smaller box, and they've got this entire coffin that's empty now. Donald was off, carrying the metal box of pig remains, and the smell gradually followed him. Looks like you were right, Shady said, sitting down on the coffin like a balloon gone flat. What'd you call it? A mole. A mole, Shady repeated, rubbing his whiskers. So there's someone among us in Manifest who's feeding information to Burton. I wouldn't have believed it. Both sat for a moment, lost in thought and speculation as to who the mole might be. Then Shady stood. Well, we're not going to figure it out sitting here. Give me a hand with this lid. Shady and Jinx opened the coffin and inspected the dozens of bottles resting in a bed of straw so as not to clink against each other.
Well, isn't that smart?
So how did they get their elixir to the abandoned mine shaft?
By putting
In
it
a coffin.
with a stinky dead pig.
With a stinky dead pig, that's right. We dug the hole, we might as well use it, Shady said. That way the stuff will not be in plain sight in case someone else happens along. Jinx climbed into the pit, then helped lower the pine box. Shady eased in after him, and the two hunkered down like soldiers in the trenches, their backs up against the wall. Dusk faded to dark. So now they're down in the hole with the coffin down inside there, sitting on the ground. Jinx broke the silence. You think folks will find us here? Shady answered with certainty. They'll find us. Another few moments passed and Jinx spoke again. Shady? Yes. Do you think a person can be cursed? How do you mean? Cursed, like when a fella doesn't mean for bad things to happen, but they just sort of follow him around like his shadow? Well, I don't know for sure, Shady answered, speaking as one with a few shadows of his own. I suppose it's either a matter of outrunning your shadow or staring it down in the light. Staring it down, huh? Easy as that. Shady shook his head and let out a breath. Nothing easy about it. Don't let nobody tell you otherwise. The two sat in silence until they noticed a figure emerging from the woods, and then another and another. They knew to keep away from the sheriff and Burton were They knew to keep away when the sheriff and Burton were around, but now the sick and weary had returned. Shady and Jinx remained in the open grave, pulling out bottle after bottle. They worked steadily distributing the elixir. It was an eerie sight, Shady and Jinx, their arms reaching up from the ground as if the dead could provide some comfort to the living. Private Ned Gillen, September 12th, 1918.
Private Ned Gillen writing this here letter. September 12th, 1918. Dear Jinx, do the Ackersons still have that Shetland sheepdog? The one that could round up a whole herd of cows, practically lining them up single file? That must be how Sarge got his nickname. Fellas in other battalions know him as First Sergeant Daniels, but he's always been Shep to us. He got hit by a mortar shell yesterday. The guys and me, we were still sitting around like a bunch of scared kids. Oh, we all talked big and cocky, but he was like our dad and we were his boys. We loved him. We'd have walked into a swarm of bees if he told us to. Now, that's a real sergeant. But he's the one who walked into it this time. Way I heard it, the guys were under heavy fire. Hank Turner got shot in the leg and was stranded out in no man's land. That's the area between one side and the other side, and they're fighting back and forth. So that area in between them is no man's land.
Which is why the Widow Kane's land, that chapter that introduced us to the Widow Kane's land, was called No Man's Land, because the mine and the townspeople are fighting back and forth over this land.
So Sergeant Daniels, also known as Shep to the boys, Shep had to go get his man, Hank Turner, because Hank was shot in the leg and couldn't move in no man's land. Shep barked at the men to stay put and headed out to get him. He carried Hank 40 yards and shoved him into the ditch before the mortar shell got him. Last I saw Shep, I was leaving to make a run to the 63rd Battalion. I didn't salute, of course, this close to the front. You don't salute officers. That only tells Heine who's in charge. Heine is, of course, a German on the other side of no man's land, shooting at the boys. But our guys had a sort of vocal salute to show Sarge our respect. She put a little chirpy cricket sound. As I started my trot out yesterday, I gave Shep that quick cricket salute. He conked me in the back of the head with a pine cone for it, but we were his boys. We knew it, and he knew it. I was making my way back last night. Couldn't figure out what was going on in these woods. Sounded like a bunch of crickets were singing to high heaven. I joined in before I realized it was our final salute to old Shep. It sounded pretty, real pretty. Ned. P.S. Hey, buddy, can you do me a favor? I'd do it myself, but I'm not there, and I want it done in words, out loud. Tell Pop I love him.